Throughout more than 20 years, Francesco Totti not only played on the pitch, he also lived in a silent internal struggle that no one really saw. A life where he had to become the symbol for AS Roma, had to always be strong, always loyal, always the hope of an entire city, while deep inside, he was still a vulnerable human being carrying the fear of failure and the feeling of being trapped in his own choices. He was not allowed to leave, not allowed to make mistakes, not allowed to be weak, because every step he took no longer belonged to him alone, but to millions of people watching, and that created an indescribable pressure. There were long nights when the cheers had faded. He had to face the silence and the question of whether he was living his own life or just fulfilling the role that fate and the city had placed on his shoulders. But even while being pulled between two lives, he never gave up, never turned away. He continued to step onto the field, continued to give everything, continued to endure, not because he had no choice, but because he had chosen to stay and accepted to pay the price for that choice with everything he had, turning pain into motivation, turning loneliness into strength to survive through every match, every season, every year that never stopped. And from that endurance, a legend was created. Francesco Totti debuted for Roma's first team in 1993, when he was just 17 years old, and remained completely loyal throughout his 25-year career, with a single jersey, playing a total of more than 780 matches and scoring more than 300 goals, becoming the all-time top scorer and the player with the most appearances in the club's history. He helped Roma win the Serie A title in the 2000-2001 season, 2 Coppa Italia titles, and 2 Italian Super Cups. He won the Serie A Top Scorer Award in the 2006-2007 season and a European Golden Shoe in the same year, a rare achievement for a player in Italy. On the international stage, he was a key part of the Italy team that won the 2006 World Cup, contributing decisive moments even while playing with a serious injury. He was named multiple times to the Serie A Team of the Year, ranked among the top goal scorers in the league's history, and above all, the numbers. He became a rare symbol of loyalty in modern football. A man who rejected the biggest offers to stay where he belonged, building a legacy not just with trophies, but with a commitment that very few could achieve in his era. Before continuing the journey behind the spotlight of Francesco Totti, please hit like and leave a small gesture of respect for the man who chose loyalty even when it made him suffer more than anyone. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the next story will take you to the hidden corners that even those who love him the most have never truly seen. Francesco Totti was born and raised in Rome, in a family that was not wealthy but full of closeness, where love was always present. But the future of the little boy seemed to have been drawn from very early on by hands bigger than his own. In an ordinary house in the ancient city, football was not just a game, but a path out of the limits of life. And even when Totti was too young to understand how the world worked, his mother saw something special in him, a talent that could change the fate of the whole family, and it was she who played the decisive role in shaping the path he would take, from firmly keeping him at Roma to rejecting offers to leave when Totti was not yet old enough to understand the meaning of those choices. For her, Roma was not just a city but the place where her son belonged, and that sense of belonging gradually became an unbreakable bond, even when Totti had never spoken up to agree or oppose. In the early years of his life, while other children were still discovering themselves, Totti was placed on an almost fixed path. Opportunities from bigger clubs began to appear very early, but they were all rejected before he could understand what they meant. Doors that could lead to another life closed quietly, without noise, without argument, simply decisions made for him. And that created a painful paradox. A child grew up with the reputation that he belonged to a place but never had the chance to ask himself whether he wanted to belong there or not. Totti's childhood was not a series of days of free choice, but a journey guided step by step, where every major decision had already been shaped before he could understand its meaning. When he began to enter the early years of his youth career, Totti gradually became the hope of Roma's academy, but at the same time, pressure also began to form silently. Not pressure from failure, but pressure from the expectation that he had to become the symbol of the city, had to keep a promise that no one had ever asked if he was ready for, invitations from other clubs, opportunities that could completely change the life of a young player, all disappeared one after another after decisions made by the adults, and each time like that, a small part of Totti's right to choose was gradually taken away without leaving a clear trace, leaving only a vague feeling that his life was heading in a direction he did not fully control. As he grew older, Totti increasingly realized a strange thing, that he was not just playing football for Roma, but was becoming Roma. His image began to be tied to the city, to the fans, to the history of the club, and that made the boundary between himself and the symbol gradually disappear. He was no longer a boy looking for his own path, but a part of a bigger story where every personal choice was dissolved into collective expectations. And it was in that dissolution that a silent feeling began to form, the feeling that his life had been chosen before he had the chance to live it. That was the foundation of a special, but also full of contradictions life, where love for a city became an unbreakable bond, where loyalty was not only a choice but gradually became destiny, and where a child grew up with the belief that he belonged to Roma, but deep inside had never had the chance to understand that he could belong somewhere else. And from there, the story of two parallel lives began to form, one life seen by the world, and one life silently kept in things that were never asked. Francesco Totti entered the AS Roma Academy not simply as a dreamy boy, but as someone who already carried within him the image of an entire city. His talent was quickly recognized not only by the coaches, but also by those who had long seen football as part of Rome's life. From the very first training sessions, Totti showed something different. Not noise or showmanship, but a natural feeling that he was born to touch the ball in a way no one else could copy. Every touch, every pass, every moment holding the ball carried an unusual calmness for a child. When the first steps took Totti to the first team while still very young, everything happened faster than he could understand. From a youth player in the academy, he stepped into the professional world, where every gaze became heavy, where every touch of the ball was no longer pure joy, but a test for the future. The dream he had nurtured since childhood began to appear clearly before his eyes, but with it came ever greater pressure. Pressure not only from coaches or teammates, but from the city of Rome itself, which was beginning to see him as a potential symbol, a person who could bring hope. The closer he got to the big stage lights, the more Totti clearly felt the change within himself. From a boy who played football just for fun, he gradually became someone who had to carry expectations, where every match was not just an opportunity to show talent, but an obligation to prove that the trust placed in him was right. And that transition created a silent distance between the person inside and the image outside, because while the world saw a young talent shining, inside Totti, a feeling began to emerge that he was no longer completely free in his own dream. Maturity happened not in a natural way, but in a way pushed by responsibility. When those around him began to talk about him as the future of Roma, when every time he stepped on the field was tied to the expectation that he had to change the match, had to bring results, had to become the answer to the club's years of disappointment. In that process, the boy who loved football gradually turned into a young man who had to learn to endure pressure instead of just enjoying the game. Step by step, innocence was replaced by caution, and pure joy was replaced by responsibility. The most painful thing was not the fame that came too early, but the feeling that the dream Totti had once pursued was now holding him tightly, as if the path he chose had begun to have its own will, no longer depending on personal desire. And every time he stood on the field, he no longer felt he was freely playing football, but was performing a predetermined role. where mistakes were no longer a natural part of growing up, but became unacceptable. In that shift, Totti began to live in a strange state, where he was both the person pursuing the dream and the person being held back by that very dream. And the further he advanced in his career, the clearer that feeling became, as if the door opened for him was also the door closing all other paths, making life no longer a journey of discovery, but a journey of maintaining an image that the world had begun to trust too early. And from here, the first layers of the second life began to form, silently, unnoticed by anyone, but strong enough to follow him for many years afterward. Francesco Totti not only grew up in the colors of AS Roma, but also grew up under the gaze of the entire city of Rome, where the love for him was not light or temporary, but an almost absolute possession, an affection that made him the center of all hopes, all dreams, and all disappointments of millions of people. And it was in that love that the boundary between a player and a symbol began to blur, when every time Totti stepped onto the field, he was no longer simply a young player developing but the embodiment of an entire city looking for salvation in football. Rome loved Totti in a special way unlike anywhere else. They did not just cheer for him when he won, but also kept him even when there was a chance to leave, turning loyalty from a personal choice into a collective expectation, where leaving Roma was no longer seen as a professional decision, but as a betrayal of an entire community, and that gradually placed Totti in a position where he could not make mistakes, because when a person becomes a symbol, every mistake, no matter how small, was no longer a personal mistake, but a crack in the faith of millions of people. Pressure from the media and fans grew with each season, not just articles or comments, but an atmosphere surrounding him every time he left the pitch, where every action was observed, every decision was analyzed, and every sign of weakness was magnified, making Totti no longer have the right to experience the normalcy of a young player. He could not simply make a mistake and stand up, could not turn a bad match into a personal lesson, because in the eyes of the city, he always had to be the guide, always the one who kept hope from being allowed to fade. Gradually, Totti's life was narrowed down to the very role that Rome had given him, a role that was both glory and chains, when he was no longer allowed to exist as a normal player with the natural ups and downs of a career, but had to live as a symbol that was always stable, always resilient, always loyal. And that stability itself became a form of invisible pressure, because the more he was loved, the less right he had to be weak. The more he was honored, the more tightly he was held in the image others wanted to see. Rome's love was initially motivation, strength that helped Totti mature faster, helped him step through big matches with the feeling that he was not alone. But over time, that love gradually turned into an inescapable pull, keeping him there not only with pride, but with responsibility as well. Because if he left, he would not just leave a club, but abandon a symbol that the city had built around him, and that made every personal decision heavier than any trophy. Deep down, Totti began to understand that he was not just playing football for Roma, but living for Roma, that every run he made no longer belonged to him alone, but to millions of people who looked to him as a spiritual anchor. And it was in that dissolution that he gradually lost the ability to distinguish between love and bondage, between freedom and responsibility, between choice and duty. Rome had given Totti everything: worship, respect, immortality, and football memory. But Rome had also unintentionally taken away from him something more important than all the titles: the right to live like a normal person, to make mistakes, to leave, to start over somewhere else. And when those things disappeared, Totti was no longer just a player who grew up with the city, but became a person held back by the very love he could never refuse. And that was when his second life began to become clearer than ever. Not loud, not dramatic, but silently existing in parallel with the spotlight that the whole world still saw every week on the pitch. Francesco Totti entered a phase where his career was no longer just the story of a young talent at AS Roma, but became one of the most symbolic choices in modern football history, when offers from big clubs began to appear like doors opening to a completely different life, especially from Real Madrid, where they promised titles, European spotlight, and a status that any player would find hard to refuse. But for Totti, each offer was not just a professional opportunity, but a profound question about himself, about who he was outside of Roma, and whether a person could leave the place that had defined his entire existence. Those days, the decision did not come immediately but existed as a silent pressure that dragged on. When Totti stood between two worlds, one side was safety, absolute love from the city, immortality in the hearts of the fans. The other side was Champions League titles, the biggest stages in Europe, and a life that could be told through more brilliant successes. And that contrast created one of the most important moments of his life, not on the pitch, but in the silence of thoughts that were never made public. In the end, Totti chose to stay at Roma, a decision praised by the whole world as a symbol of loyalty, something rare in modern football where players often leave to seek glory. But for him, it was not simply an idealistic decision, but an acceptance of a trade-off, giving up opportunities that others considered the peak of a career, in order to keep something that only he fully understood the value of, the feeling of belonging to one single place, even if that meant abandoning other paths that could have changed his entire personal history. The outside world looked in and saw a hero, an irreplaceable symbol of loyalty, someone who had rejected greater light to stay with the heart of his city, and that image quickly became part of the global football heritage. But behind that praise was a silence that only Totti understood, because every word of praise for his loyalty was also a reminder that he had chosen not to leave, that he had chosen a single path, and from that moment the remaining roads never came back. As his career continued, bigger titles began to drift further away. The Champions League trophies that many teammates and rivals achieved became images he could only watch from afar, not because of lack of ability, but because he had chosen not to step into systems that could have taken him further. And in that choice, another life gradually formed in his imagination, a life where Totti could be the player of glorious European nights, of consecutive finals, of a career measured by more titles than years of loyalty. But that life never became reality. Over time, Totti began to live with two versions of himself. One version the world saw, the loyal captain, the symbol of Roma, and another version that existed only in his thoughts, where he wondered what would have happened if he had left earlier, if he had accepted bigger offers, if he had not been held back by the love of a city. And this parallel existence created a very special kind of sadness. Not public regret, but the feeling of a life that had never been lived. But what made Totti's choice special was not only what he achieved, but what he had given up without ever saying it out loud, because there was no resistance, no public regret, only a long silence that stretched over many years, where he continued to play, continued to contribute, continued to become the symbol, while the part of the other life grew farther away, not forgotten, but kept as a possibility that was never allowed to happen. And precisely from the moment he decided to stay at Roma, Totti's life was no longer just the story of a loyal player, but became the story of a man who had chosen a single path, while losing the ability to know what would have happened if he had chosen another, a choice that brought immortality in the eyes of the fans, but also created a second life that would forever exist only in silence, unseen by anyone yet, always present in every run he made for many years afterward. Francesco Totti entered the years when the spotlight no longer carried the vibrant colors as before, when AS Roma repeatedly went through seasons that did not meet expectations. Opportunities for titles slipped away in regret, and each failure placed even heavier pressure on the captain's shoulders. because in the eyes of the fans he was not just a player, but the soul of the entire team, the one who had to take responsibility for every unfulfilled hope. And that made every match become a test not only of skill, but also of endurance. In this period, criticism began to appear more often, not because Totti had completely declined, but because the expectations placed on him had never decreased. People still expected him to create miracles in every moment, still waited for him to save matches that seemed lost, and when that did not happen, questions began to arise. Comparisons began to be made, and even those who once worshipped him started to question their faith. But the paradox was that even when criticized, he remained the center of the team, still irreplaceable, still the first name mentioned when talking about Roma. And that parallelism created a special pressure that very few players could understand. In public, Totti still maintained a calm image, a composed captain, not loud, not overreacting, always appearing with an almost natural resilience, as if he was born to endure the storms of football. But behind that image was a long, exhausting process, where each unsuccessful season was not just a sporting result, but a small crack in the spirit, accumulating over time and making the feeling of being trapped in his own role increasingly clear, because he could not leave, could not change the environment, could not start over somewhere else. All he could do was continue to step onto the field and continue to carry the burden. Totti's inner world in this phase became more complex, when persistence no longer came purely from passion, but from the feeling that there was no other path to choose. Because the earlier choice to stay at Roma had locked away every possibility of change, making each passing day a continuation of the old decision. And in that continuation, he began to feel more clearly the fatigue not only of the body but of the spirit, a kind of tiredness that did not come from one match, but from hundreds of matches that had passed in the same loop of expectation and disappointment. Nevertheless, Totti continued, still played, still held the central role in the team, because he understood that his image had become an inseparable part of Roma. And stopping or leaving was no longer a simple choice, but something that could change the entire relationship between him and the city, between him and the millions who saw him as a symbol. And that made his persistence carry a different meaning. Not a free choice, but an unbreakable bond. As time went on, the feeling of being trapped in his own role became clearer, when each match was not just an opportunity to win, but a reminder that time was passing, that the body was gradually changing, that peak moments were becoming rarer, but the responsibility never decreased. And in that contrast, Totti continued to live with two layers of existence. One layer was the image the world saw, and one layer was the silent feeling that he was moving forward, without being able to turn in any other direction. Those were the years when his smile still appeared on the field, still captured in celebration moments, still remembered by fans as a symbol of faith. But behind that smile was a long journey of endurance, where each passing day was no longer about discovery, but about continuation. And it was in that continuation that Totti's second life, the life of unspoken thoughts, of possibilities that never happened, began to feel heavier than ever, silently existing in parallel with the light that the whole world still saw from the Olimpico Stadium every weekend. Francesco Totti entered 2006 with a body standing on a fragile line between continuing and stopping, when, in what seemed like a very ordinary moment on the pitch, a collision changed the entire trajectory of his career at AS Roma, leaving a serious injury to his ankle that was not just a simple medical issue, but a deep cut into the future of a man who had tied his entire life to football. And from that second, everything around Totti was no longer the same. The pain did not come once and disappear, but lingered as a constant presence in every step, every training session, every touch of the ball, making his body a silent battlefield where no one really saw the full extent of the damage. And while the outside world only saw a player trying to recover to return to the pitch, inside Totti was a non-stop struggle with the limits of his own body, where each passing day was a question about whether he could continue or not. The recovery process was full of difficulties, with long rehabilitation sessions, recurring pain, small steps forward mixed with setbacks that made everything uncertain. But what was most remarkable was not the severity of the injury, but the way Totti faced it, because instead of accepting to stop to protect himself, he chose to return to the pitch much earlier than recommended, when his body had not fully recovered, when every run still carried signs of the injury, yet the responsibility to the team and to the city made him unable to stay on the sidelines. At that time, the body became the clearest limit Totti had to face, because before he could rely on technique, experience, and the ability to read the game to overcome opponents. But after the injury, every movement came with consideration, every acceleration came with risk, and that created a profound change in the way he played football. When football was no longer absolute freedom, but became a control between desire and actual ability. But even when his body was no longer in its best state, Totti's responsibility never decreased, because he was still the symbol of Roma, still the one the team relied on in important moments. And that coexistence between physical limits and spiritual expectations created a special pressure, where he had to continue playing not because his body allowed it, but because his role did not allow him to stop. And in that tension, every match became a test not only of technique, but of the ability to endure. What few people saw most in this period was Totti's silence in the face of pain, a silence not expressed through words or actions, but existing in the way he continued to step onto the field even though he knew his body was no longer perfect, in the way he hid his fatigue after playing moments, and in the way he accepted to live with a more limited version of himself without ever turning that into a reason to leave the team. The 2006 injury not only changed the way Totti played, but also changed the way he existed in football. When every movement became more conscious, every decision carried caution, and every match was a balance between what he wanted to do and what his body allowed. But even so, he continued, still stood there, still wore the colors of Roma, as if stopping had never really been an option. And it was in that silence that another deeper layer of Totti's life began to become clearer, where the light of the stadium could not completely cover the inner pains, and where resilience no longer carried the color of glory but became a form of existence, a way to continue living in a life where the body had begun to lack the strength to keep up with what the heart and responsibility demanded, creating an increasingly clear gap between the outside image and the inside reality that no one could truly see in full. Francesco Totti entered the summer of 2006 with a mental state that very few people outside could fully understand, when he not only carried the expectations of AS Roma on his shoulders, but also carried a body that had just gone through a serious injury that seemed like it could end his career. But despite everything, he was still present in the Italy national team participating in the FIFA World Cup 2006, a tournament that would later become the peak of fame in his international career, but at the same time was also one of the most emotionally complex moments. When Italy advanced deep into the tournament, Totti was no longer a player in perfect condition. He played within the limits of his body, in the caution of every movement, but still contributed to the historic journey of the national team. And when the final moment of victory came, when Italy won the World Championship, the image of Totti lifting the World Cup trophy became one of the greatest symbols of Italian football. A moment that millions of fans had waited for their entire lives. But the strange thing was, right in that very moment of glory, Totti did not completely feel the liberation that the world expected, because behind the spotlight of the championship was a very deep silence inside him, a feeling that was hard to name, as if he had just touched the greatest thing a player could achieve but could not find the corresponding change in his inner world, where the pressures, the responsibilities, and the bonds remained completely intact. While the fans celebrated, while the whole country of Italy was immersed in the joy of victory, Totti stood in the middle of all that, with a feeling of both pride and distance, because the World Cup championship was the peak that any player would dream of. But for him, it did not make the limits that had formed many years earlier disappear. did not reduce the expectations that Rome placed on him, and also did not change the reality that he was still the irreplaceable symbol of Roma. After the tournament, when everyone returned to normal life, Totti came back to the club with a very different mindset, because instead of feeling liberated, he carried a more subtle heaviness, as if he had reached the peak, but could not find a new path behind it, and that made his subsequent journey more complex when all eyes continued to turn to him with the same level of expectation, as if the World Championship had not changed anything in the structure of responsibility he was carrying. In the following years, Totti's career continued to be tied to Roma, where he remained the center of the team, still the one who made the difference in important moments. But at the same time, he also had to face an unchanged reality, that every success of his was placed in the context of loyalty, while every failure was magnified by the symbolic position he held. And this parallelism made his life never return to a simple state of balance. What was most notable in this period was not what happened on the pitch, but the way Totti continued to exist in his role, when he no longer played just for titles or personal recognition, but because of a sense of responsibility that had sunk deep into himself, a responsibility that was unspoken but always present, that he had to continue being the anchor for a club, for a city, for a community that had tied its life to his image. And it was in that continuation that the second life he had lived for many years began to become clearer than ever, because if the world only saw a World Cup champion, a symbol of Italian football, then inside him he was still a man, continuing to walk on a journey with no turns, where every peak only brought an additional layer of responsibility, and where the silence after glory sometimes felt even heavier than the pressures before. The moment of lifting the World Cup in 2006 was therefore not only the peak of his career, but also a subtle turning point in Totti's life, where he achieved the greatest thing in international football, but at the same time realized that the most important things in his life had not changed at all. And from there, the journey of a man living between two lives continued to stretch on, not loud, not dramatic, but deeper and heavier in a way that only he himself could fully feel. Francesco Totti stepped out of the spotlight of the FIFA World Cup 2006 with an undeniable status in the history of Italian football. But when he returned to everyday life with AS Roma, he did not only bring back the title, but also carried an image that the whole world had shaped. A loyal man, a symbol of stability, and that unintentionally became the foundation for another story beginning to form off the pitch, the story of a seemingly perfect family. Totti's marriage to Ilari Blasi was viewed by the public as a symbol of ideal love, where a football legend combined with a famous television face, creating an almost perfect family image in the eyes of the Italian media, moments appearing together, smiles in front of the cameras, and public events that made fans believe that behind the pressure-filled pitch, Totti had found a peaceful place to return to, a home solid enough to balance all the burdens that his career placed on his shoulders. For many years, that image was reinforced by the media, by stories of a happy family, children growing up under the care of both father and mother, and a life that seemed to have no cracks. But it was precisely in that perfection that invisible pressures began to form. Because when a family becomes a symbol in the public eye, it is no longer allowed to exist in a normal way. Every private moment could be seen, every small change could be interpreted, and privacy was gradually replaced by another kind of expectation, that everything must always be as stable as the image the world had believed in. Over time, the distance between the two people in the relationship began to appear, not through big events, but through small things that accumulated gradually. When the dense football schedule made Totti spend more time in the world of the pitch than in the family space, while Ilari Blasi also had her own life in the television industry, where the rhythm of life, pressure, and public attention were no less intense, and that parallelism created an unspoken gap, where the two still appeared together in public but began to live in different rhythms. What made the cracks hard to notice was that both still maintained the image of an ideal family in front of the media, still appeared together at events, still held the role of an admired couple. But behind those images was a silence that grew longer and longer in private life, where conversations became fewer, where sharing was no longer as natural as before, and where unspoken issues began to exist like gaps that could not be filled. The pressure from fame came not only from football, but also from living in a constantly public image, when every decision in the family could be seen and judged, making it more difficult to resolve private problems, because the safe space to make mistakes or show weakness almost did not exist, and that forced both of them to keep many things in silence rather than face them directly. In this period, Totti continued his role at Roma, still the center of the team, still the symbol of the city, but at the same time, he also began to feel more clearly the separation between his two worlds. One world where he was worshipped as a legend, and one world where he was just a man trying to maintain balance in a family under pressure from both fame and time, and that separation made him live in an increasingly complex state. The signs of cracks did not appear in the form of clear events, but like small fractures spreading gradually in the foundation when the silence between the two lasted longer, when shared moments became fewer, when misunderstandings were not explained, and when unexpressed emotions began to accumulate into a distance that no one really admitted, because from the outside everything still looked perfect. But inside, the rhythm of life had changed. Totti never spoke publicly about what was happening in the family during that period, because for him, maintaining the image was not only a personal responsibility, but also part of the way he existed in the public world. But that very silence created a second layer of life, where he continued to perform his role as a husband, a father under the gaze of society, while the real issues only existed in the private space that no one saw. And just like the way he had lived two lives in football, he began to live two lives in his own family. One life that was seen, where everything seemed stable, and another life that existed in the silences, where emotions were not spoken, gaps were not filled, and small changes gradually became the foundation for a crack that only became truly clear many years later, when everything could no longer be hidden by the perfect image in front of the public. Francesco Totti entered the final years of his career in the colors of AS Roma with a truth that no one could avoid. Time was no longer on his side. Speed gradually decreased. Bursts of pace were no longer as sharp as before, and his body began to send clear signals that it had gone through too many tough seasons. But the hardest thing was not the physical decline, but accepting that he himself had changed. Throughout 2 decades, Totti had always been the center of the team, the one who decided matches, the spiritual anchor, the symbol in which the entire city of Rome placed its faith. But when his form could no longer be maintained at the highest level, he was forced to face a new reality, where his role was no longer absolute as before, where moments on the pitch no longer lasted like the glorious years, and where every time sitting on the bench also became a difficult experience for someone who had once been the soul of the team. The greatest difficulty for Totti was not in losing the ability to play at the highest level, but in having to accept the change in himself. Because throughout his life he had never known any other version besides the version of a central player, someone always present in every important moment. And when that role began to shrink, an inner void gradually appeared, making him no longer sure who he was if he was no longer standing on the pitch. The attachment to football was not just a profession, but Totti's entire identity, the way he defined himself, the way he existed in this world, and for that reason, leaving the pitch was not simply a professional decision, but became an existential question, because if there was no more football, what would be left of him? And that question gradually became a silent fear that continued to grow over time. Each passing season, Totti continued to play, even if he no longer started regularly, even if his time on the field was less. But he still appeared whenever the team needed him, still created decisive moments at times when it seemed there was not much left to prove. And in those moments, the fans still saw the familiar image of a legend. But behind that was a body that had to endure more than anyone could see from the outside. What was special in this period was the internal struggle between two inner worlds. One side was the desire to continue playing, because football was not just work but breath, identity, the whole life, and the other side was the truth that the body no longer had the ability to maintain the previous intensity. And in that struggle, Totti did not choose to stop, not because he did not recognize his own limits, but because stopping meant having to face a void he had never prepared for. The greatest fear of Totti in the final years of his career was not failure, nor injury, but leaving the pitch and losing the very identity that had shaped him throughout his life, because for more than 20 years, he was not just a player, but the symbol of Rome. And when a person becomes a symbol for too long, separating from that role becomes almost impossible, as if his existence only had meaning when seen in the colors of AS Roma. Therefore, Totti continued to move forward, continued to train, continued to play even though he knew that every match was a bigger challenge than before, because time no longer brought favor, but responsibility remained intact, and in that continuation, he gradually entered a phase where exhaustion was no longer temporary, but became a prolonged state, where body and mind had to bear the pressure of a career that refused to stop at the same time. Nevertheless, what made people remember Totti was not the decline, but the way he refused to turn that decline into a reason to disappear. When he still continued to appear on the field, still fought in every limited minute given, still kept within him the spirit of a man who had never left the game. And that very persistence made his image in the eyes of the fans not diminish, but instead become even deeper, because they saw in him not just a player, but a human being trying to hold on to a part of himself that time was gradually taking away. And throughout that entire journey, Totti's second life, the life of unanswered questions, of irreversible choices, of possibilities that never happened, continued to exist in parallel, quieter than ever, while the outside world only saw a legend still trying to keep going, even though each step at this point already carried clear traces of time and human limits. Francesco Totti entered 2017 with a truth that both he and AS Roma could no longer delay, that an important chapter in modern football history was coming to an end. In his final match at the Olimpico Stadium was not just a sporting event, but a moment of farewell to an entire era, where a man who had been tied for life to one jersey was preparing to say goodbye to the very place that had defined him. That day, the stadium was filled with emotion, with no boundaries between spectators and players, between past and present, when tens of thousands of people stood up in tears to see for the last time the familiar image of Totti in Roma colors. And every run he made on the field then no longer carried tactical or result meaning, but became an act of memory, or every moment was stretched as if time was trying to hold on to something that could not continue. The moment the final whistle sounded was also the moment the entire stadium seemed to stop, when the Serie A 2017 farewell match became a wordless farewell ceremony, where Totti stood in the middle of the field, looking at the stands, looking at his teammates, and seemed to try to record everything into memory before it all disappeared. And in the embrace of the fans, in the tears that could not be hidden, he not only left the pitch, but also left the role that had defined his entire life. But the strange thing that happened afterward was that the world's attention did not last as long as the emotion of the moment, because the media quickly moved on to other stories, other matches, new stars. And in a short time, the image of Totti saying goodbye to the pitch gradually withdrew from the main headlines, leaving a void that only he could truly feel, because for the public it was a memorable event. But for him, it was the end of the entire structure of his life. After retirement, Totti's life fell into a silence completely different from everything he had ever experienced, with no more cheers, no more match schedules, no more training sessions, and no clear role to step into each day, one time that had once been filled with football suddenly became empty. And it was in that emptiness that the feeling of disorientation began to appear more clearly than ever. For many years, Totti had lived in a fixed rhythm of football, where every week there was a match, every day had a goal, and every moment had clear meaning. But when all of that disappeared, he began to face a new reality, where nothing shaped his day anymore. And that change did not happen loudly, but came slowly, yet profoundly, like a familiar structure being dismantled piece by piece without a new blueprint to replace it. The feeling of being left behind did not come from being forgotten, but from no longer having a specific position in the world where he had once been the center, when AS Roma continued to play, continued to exist. But Totti was no longer a direct part of it, and that separation made him face a question that had never appeared clearly before. Who would a person be when there was no longer the role that his entire life had been tied to? This ending did not come with full preparation, because although Totti had known the day of farewell would come, nothing could really prepare him for the emptiness afterward, when everything that had once given meaning suddenly disappeared, and even titles, memories, or honors could not fill the prolonged silence of each day. In that silence, Totti's second life, the life of unspoken thoughts, of choices that could not be reversed, of a man who had lived too long in the spotlight, began to become clearer, not as an abstract concept, but as a daily reality, where he had to learn to exist without the sound of his name being called from the stands anymore, and where the ending was not a single moment, but a prolonged process with no clear stopping point. And it was from here that Totti's post-football journey was no longer the story of a legend who had just retired, but became the story of a man trying to find himself again, in a world that had once defined him too clearly, but had not prepared him for a way to start over when everything had ended. And that was when silence became the only thing left to face each next day of his life. Francesco Totti entered the post-retirement phase with a reality he had never truly prepared for throughout more than 2 decades tied to AS Roma. When the bonds that seemed eternal began to show cracks, not on the pitch, but right in the place once considered home, where he had devoted his entire life, and the conflict with the club's leadership did not come as a single shock, but as a prolonged process, where silent disagreements gradually accumulated into a gap that could not be narrowed. For many years, Totti had believed that the love for Roma was unbreakable, that his loyalty would be reciprocated with absolute respect in every stage of life. But when his role in the club changed, when he was no longer the center of the pitch, but became part of the backstage structure, differences in viewpoints, in visions of the future, and in his role began to become clear. And it was in those unpublicized conversations that Totti gradually realized that even the most seemingly solid relationships could change over time. The decision to leave the attached position after retirement did not come from a single moment, but was the result of multiple layers of pressure. When he felt he was no longer placed in the right position, in the place that had once been his entire life, and that departure was not only professional, but also a spiritual separation. Because leaving Roma for Totti was not like leaving a job, but like leaving a part of himself that had existed since he was a child. Right after that, his life continued to be eroded by unavoidable losses when the COVID-19 pandemic brought a major shock to his personal life with the passing of his father, Enzo Totti, who had once been an important part in his journey of growing up. And this loss was not only family pain, but also the breaking of a spiritual anchor that had existed for a very long time, making Totti face a void that could not be filled by any football achievement or memory. His father's passing came at a time when Totti was already going through many changes, making the pain not stop at one event, but become part of a continuous chain of incidents, where things that had once brought a sense of stability gradually disappeared in a short period of time. and that rapid succession left him with no chance to fully recover between losses, as each new event piled onto old wounds. In this period, Totti began to feel more clearly than ever the absence of the anchors that had once shaped his life. When there was no longer a pitch to return to every week, no fixed role in the club, and no longer a father to share deep things with, and that simultaneous absence created a state he had never experienced before. A state that was not intense pain but a prolonged emptiness, where everything that once had meaning seemed to be gradually fading. The hardest thing was not each individual loss, but the way they connected into a continuous chain, leaving Totti with no pause to breathe, no space to recover fully, because as soon as one wound began to settle, another wound appeared, and in that chain of events, the feeling of stability in life began to disappear. Looking back, Totti realized that he was not only facing the end of his football career, but also witnessing the disintegration of many structures that had once made up his life, from the club, family, to the familiar roles he had once relied on to define himself. And in that disintegration, he could no longer clearly answer the question of who he was beyond the titles and memories that had passed. In all those upheavals, the feeling of losing anchors became the clearest thing, when there was no longer a single place to return to with certainty, and that made Totti's life after football become a new journey, no longer defined by matches or glory, but by the search for himself again in a world that had changed too fast compared to what he had once known, where everything that had once brought stability now remained only as memories gradually fading with time. Francesco Totti entered a stage in life that even those who had followed him throughout his career at AS Roma could hardly imagine, when his personal life that had been built as a perfect image gradually came into the light in a way no one wanted, and his marriage to Ilari Blasi, once seen as a symbol of ideal love in Italian sports and television circles, began to show cracks that could no longer be hidden. The information about the divorce spread widely among the public, not as a single event, but as a prolonged wave, where every small detail was analyzed, every action was interpreted, and every silence became a topic of discussion, making Totti not only face changes in his private life, but also have to live under the constant pressure of the media, where his personal story no longer belonged to him or his family alone, but became part of an uncontrollable public space. The collapse of the perfect family image did not happen in a single moment, but was the result of years of accumulated pressure, distance, and changes in the rhythm of life of two people who had once been tied together in the same public image. And when that perfect shell began to break, what remained was not only the disappointment of the fans, but also a deeper sense of loss for Totti himself, because the family image had once been one of the most important anchors that helped him balance the pressure of the pitch and personal life. During that time, pressure from public opinion became an inseparable part of daily life, when every piece of information was exaggerated, every rumor had its own weight, and every action was viewed from the angle of a bigger story, leaving no clear boundary between private life and public image. And that lack of boundary made handling personal issues more difficult than ever, because there was no longer a safe space to keep real emotions. The most painful thing was not the breakup itself, but the way it unfolded under the gaze of millions of people, when a relationship once praised as a symbol of stability became a topic of endless debate and analysis, making Totti not only face personal sadness but also carry the additional weight of an image that society had once trusted, and that was now gradually transforming into a completely different story. When looking back, it can be seen that the relationship between Totti and Ilari Blasi was not only tested by time or professional pressure, but also by the change in the very way they existed in the public world, where each person had their own rhythm of life, their own space, and their own pressure. And when those rhythms were no longer in harmony, the silence between them gradually became clearer than any words. That silence was not an immediate end, but a prolonged process where conversations became shorter, distances became clearer, and unspoken things began to accumulate over time, until the shared space was no longer enough to hold the connection as before. And when that happened, the relationship was no longer defined by the moments that once made the public admire, but by the irreversible change in real life. Totti, who was once used to facing pressure on the pitch, now had to face a different kind of pressure, more subtle but no less heavy. When every detail in his personal life was placed under the media spotlight, making it harder than ever to maintain calm, because there was no longer a clear boundary between what was private and what was public, between the real person and the image seen. Throughout this entire period, what remained clearest was the feeling of a relationship that could no longer continue in the old way, when everything around had changed too much, when time, pressure, and non-stop attention from outside had transformed the way two people viewed their own lives. And when those changes could not be reversed, the breakup was no longer a sudden event, but became the result of a prolonged process where silence gradually replaced what had once been connection. And in that silence, Francesco Totti once again faced his second life, no longer on the pitch, no longer in the spotlight of AS Roma, but in the very personal space where the most important things that once existed also began to change shape, leaving a void that could hardly be filled by any titles or memories from the past. Francesco Totti entered a stage of life where there were no longer any opening whistles, no more match schedules, no more pressure from AS Roma, only a slower, quieter, and emptier rhythm of life compared to anything he had ever experienced throughout more than 2 decades on the pitch, where everything had once been measured by goals, by titles, by match-deciding moments, now replaced by days without clear structure, where time was no longer divided by football. Totti's current life no longer revolved around the stadium or glaring lights, but around very ordinary things, slow mornings, moments he spent with his children, where he was no longer a legend, no longer a symbol, but just a father trying to be more present in his family's life, making up for the years when football had taken almost all of his time and mind. And it was in those moments that he began to realize a different kind of meaning in life, not coming from the applause of tens of thousands of people, but from small, quiet, but real things. When the rhythm of life slowed down, silence began to become a clear part of his life, with no more cheers from the stands, no more tactical meetings, no more tense matches lasting for hours, only long stretches of time not filled by any obligations. And that silence at first became unfamiliar, because throughout his life, Totti had never truly lived in a space where everything did not revolve around football. But over time, silence was no longer something to fear, but became a kind of space for him to face himself, where memories from the past began to become clearer than ever, no longer covered by playing pressure or the rush of his career. Big matches, historic moments, injuries, important decisions, all began to return like a continuous flow, and in that he saw not only a career, but the entire journey that had shaped who he was. Time spent with his children became one of the most important parts of his current life, when Totti was no longer the captain on the field, but a father trying to be present in ordinary moments. Family meals, simple conversations, moments he had not had many opportunities to experience before. And in those seemingly small things, he began to rebuild a part of life that football had once obscured. Personal values also gradually became clearer in this period, when Totti was no longer defined by what he did on the pitch, but began to be seen through the way he lived outside the lights, the way he faced time, change, and the memories that could not be erased. And this shift created a different image of him, no longer the unchanging symbol of Rome, but a human being learning to exist in a world that no longer revolved around him. What was clearest in Totti's current life was memory, because when everything else gradually settled, memory became the only thing left that was clear and strong, the matches that had passed, The glorious moments, the difficult decisions, the unchangeable choices all became a part of him in an inseparable way, and instead of trying to run away from them, he began to learn to live with them. In this journey, there was no sudden transition or clear turning point, but a slow process, where a man who had once lived in the noise of football began to adapt to the quiet of everyday life. And in that adaptation, he did not become someone else, but became a deeper version of himself, where things once hidden by the spotlight began to appear more clearly. And it was in that silence that Francesco Totti began to learn how to live again from the beginning, not by seeking a new role to replace football, but by accepting that life was no longer defined by the pitch, but by ordinary moments, unerasable memories, and personal values that only when everything else quieted down could a person see most clearly. Francesco Totti stood at the end of a journey that he could never truly separate into clear parts, because when looking back from the very first days in Rome to the final years after the lights of AS Roma's pitch, everything in his life seemed to always exist in two parallel layers. One layer seen by the whole world, where he was the symbol, the captain, the legend of loyalty, and another, quieter layer, where he was only a human being who had to live with choices that could never be reversed, with paths that were never taken, and with questions that never had answers. From his childhood in Rome, where a boy had been shaped by circumstances, by family, and by an entire city that always looked at him as its future, Totti had entered football not just as joy, but as destiny. And when his career began, those two lives became even more clearly separated. One life was the light of the stadium, of goals, of non-stop cheers, and another life was the silence behind closed doors, where he had to face himself, pressure, and choices that had never truly belonged to him alone. For more than 20 years, those two lives existed in parallel, without ever really touching each other. Because when he stood on the field, he was the infallible symbol, the one expected to always uphold the image of AS Roma. But when the match ended, he returned to another world, where there were no cheers, where there was no clear role, and where thoughts about his true self began to appear more, creating an irreconcilable divide. Totti's success is undeniable, with titles, historic moments, and a special place in the hearts of fans. But all of that always came with trade-offs that only he himself fully felt. Because to become the symbol of loyalty, he had to give up other paths, other opportunities, and even other versions of his own life. Things that the outside world might never see but were always present in the depths of his inner world. Loyalty, the thing that brought him the most honor, was also the most important part of his legacy, not only because he stayed with AS Roma throughout his career, but because he turned that choice into a symbol beyond football, a story about attachment, about accepting limits, and about living with a decision that lasted a lifetime, even if that meant facing other lives that never happened. When stepping out of football, Totti did not really leave his life, but only moved to another stage, where memories became the clearest thing, where moments on the pitch continued to live in his mind, and where he began to understand that the value of life lies not only in what was achieved, but also in what was left behind, the choices not made, the paths not taken. But what made Totti's story special was not the greatness of his career, but the way he continued to move forward after everything, not as someone who had ended, but as someone learning to live with the rest of himself, with memories, with silence, and with a life no longer defined by the pitch, but still carrying its traces in every thought. And throughout that entire journey, the two lives he had lived never truly disappeared. They only changed shape over time. One life remembered by the whole world, and another life that existed only in the depths of himself, where there were no lights, no audience, but it was the truest part of a man who had devoted his entire life to one jersey, one city, and one choice that could not be turned back, and from there became one of the most special stories about loyalty in the history of modern football. Looking back at Francesco Totti's entire journey in the colors of AS Roma, people do not only see a football legend, but also see a life quietly divided between the spotlight and the dark corners no one really touched. From a Rome boy whose path was predetermined from very early on, to a captain carrying an entire city on his shoulders, Totti had lived in the tension between being loved unconditionally and losing the right to choose his own life. He once rejected big opportunities like Real Madrid to stay with Roma, and that decision turned him into a symbol of loyalty, but it also locked him tightly in a role he could not escape, whether from the 2006 ankle injury, the pressure after the 2006 World Cup, or even when his career gradually came to an end in 2017. The saddest thing was not the titles he achieved, but the other lives he had never lived. The possibilities left behind just to maintain an image the whole world expected. The events after retirement from leaving Roma, the passing of his father Enzo Totti during the pandemic, to the divorce with Ilari Blasi, created a chain of losses that made the feeling of anchors in his life gradually dissolve. This is no longer the story of an athlete, but the story of a human being forced to learn how to exist when all familiar roles disappear. The lesson for American audiences lies in this very truth. Success and fame never guarantee inner peace. Sometimes being honored by the whole world comes with the price of losing the right to live a normal life. Totti's story reminds us that loyalty is a beautiful value, but if one trades their entire personal identity for it, a person may unintentionally create a second life full of silence, where things never lived continue to exist as a lasting regret through time. If Francesco Totti's story has touched you, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the lives behind the spotlight that the world often does not see. Thank you for accompanying us, and see you in the next video where stories continue to be told with all the most genuine and deeply emotional feelings.